I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you here tonight. I had hoped, and I think within probably the next week, we'll have the schedule of the telecast of all of these lectures, which will be on MCAT, as they have almost always been, I think. And so we'll have that schedule for you at least by the end of the series. So keep coming back. Every week we'll have Professor Wiltse this week, and then 2 more wonderful lecturers, and then a little wine and cheese together with as many of the lecturers as can join us on that last week. So that's always a lot of fun. I wanted to introduce to you Professor Jeff Wiltse, who's been on campus with us since 2002. He has his PhD from Brandeis University, and he researches and teaches in the area of modern United States history. When we first came up with his name from the Advisory Council, we thought that we would ask him to talk about democracy in America. As many of you know, an outsider's view of the early democracy in America. But Jeff let us know that he really didn't want to talk about that. So we said, well, heck. It's not really the series of books and works of art that moved the Advisory Council. It's the series of books and art that moves all of us, changes all of us, and particularly that is dear to the hearts of our lecturers. And so we said, what the heck, go for it. And so we have Professor Jeff Wiltse tonight. Professor Wiltse is an award-winning author. He's written a book which is called Contested Waters, A Social History of Swimming Pools in America, which brings back lots of memories for me. I don't know how many of you lived in big cities where there were swimming pools back in the 50s and 60s. But in any case, brings back lots of memories for me. And his book won an award in 2007 as one of the best books by the American Association of University Presses. Jeff is here to talk to us about what might be the least familiar of any of the works that we're going to be studying in this series, and that is Gunnar Myrdal's work called An American Dilemma, which was published, I think, in 1944, 43 or 44. I haven't read it myself. I was actually put off by the fact that it's 1,000 something or other pages long, and I said to myself, I'll just read it later. But I'm very eager to find out about it, because Jeff's thesis is that this work, which was created by someone who is not an American, and I believe was funded by Carnegie Foundation funds, has become one of the most influential books in the way we discuss and think about race relations in the United States in the post-World War period and after. So with no more introduction than that, I'm going to introduce Associate Professor Jeff Wiltse of the History Department.
It's clear that I have a real challenge today. One, you now know that I insisted upon talking about this book and rejected Alexis de Tocqueville. And now I find out that no one knows anything about it. The fact that many of you were alive when it was published now makes me concerned. But hopefully by the end I will have convinced you of its historical significance. Linda, thank you very much for the introduction. I'd also like to very sincerely thank the Alumni Association for inviting me to participate in this lecture series, and Jay Kettering. I don't know how many of you know Jay. You walk past him when he's out at the table here. He's done an immense amount of work in organizing these lectures and corralling all of us faculty members, and so sincere thanks to him, but most especially thanks to you all for coming to hear what I have to say. I know that students pay to hear what I have to say, but they get something tangible out of it. The idea of people in the community paying to come to hear what I have to say is nice. So thank you. Let's start by taking ourselves back to one of the seminal moments of the civil rights movement. Greensboro, North Carolina, 1960. 4 young black men. The 4 young black men in this photograph, all of them students at North Carolina A&T College, decide that they're going to sit down at the lunch counter at the local Woolworths, and they're not going to get up until they are served just like white patrons. It is not an overstatement to claim that their act of sitting down at the Woolworth's lunch counter reignited the civil rights movement in 1960. Immediately thereafter, the sit-in movement swept across the South, and their actions that day led directly to the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which is one of the most important civil rights organizations of the era. When a journalist asked the Greensboro Four, which they commonly became known as, what caused them to decide to personally and directly challenge racial segregation, they responded that they'd been inspired by reading the works of Lillian Smith, who some of you may be familiar with, Gandhi, and by reading Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. I'll be talking with you tonight about An American Dilemma and its impact upon America during the post-war period. It was published in 1944, as Linda pointed out, and it was a study undertaken by a Swedish economist named Gunnar Myrdal. And if anyone wants to know more about his selection, ask me at the end, but I can't take time now because I only have 50 minutes. It was funded, as Linda pointed out, by the Carnegie Corporation. It wasn't funded by the federal government. It wasn't supported by a university. It was funded by the Carnegie Corporation. Research for it began in 1938, and it resulted in 1944 in the publication of these two volumes, and 1,483 pages. And in case you're curious, this is actually a first edition, which was passed down to me by a civil rights attorney, which is kind of cool. The study details the racial prejudice and the racial discrimination that was pervasive in America during this period of time. It details the bad conditions in which most African Americans lived. It identifies what Myrdal believed was the root cause of the race problem in America, and it recommends a solution to the race problem in America, all of which I'll get to when we get into the text of the lecture. Few scholarly works have influenced a society, I believe, as much as An American Dilemma influenced the United States during the post-World War II period. Myrdal's study helped reshape popular attitudes about racial difference and the place of racial minorities in American society. It guided changes in public policies, and it influenced the goals and the strategies of the civil rights movement. This tremendous impact resulted in large part from the timing of its publication. If this had been published at another time, not in 1944, it might have been largely ignored, and it would have likely had little or no impact upon prevailing racial ideologies, government policies, and social movements. But its timing was perfect, 1944. Because of the war, many Americans were sensitized to their own prejudices and were recommitting themselves, or were being recommitting themselves to the American democratic ideals of liberty, equality, and justice. This made them receptive to new ideas about race, racial difference, and the place of racial minorities in American society. In my talk tonight, I'll cover three things. First, I'll give you some historical context by describing the state of race relations in the United States leading up to the publication of American Dilemma. Next, I'll take us into the text and identify Myrdal's major conclusions, the conclusions that were most influential and significant. Finally, I'll assess, and this is where we get to the meat of it, I'll assess the impact that American Dilemma had upon the United States during the post-war period. But let's begin with the historical context. Oh, you know what? There's Gunnar Myrdal. So you can have his image in mind as I'm talking about him. In the decades prior to the publication of An American Dilemma in 1944, race relations in the United States were, to put it simply, bad and, importantly, not getting better, which I'll describe in a moment. In the South, I get very self-conscious when I look down at my notes and then I start speaking very directly into the microphone. I'll navigate through this, so don't worry. But the historical backdrop. In the South, conditions were much as they had been since the late 19th century. Very, very few African Americans could vote. Black Southerners were separated from whites in all public spheres through a dense thicket of segregation laws. Blacks occupied the lowest rung on the economic ladder, and Black Southerners were denied basic personal security. White Southerners could and did beat, rape, and even murder Black Southerners with little consequence. If conditions in the South during the 1920s and 1930s were much as they had been previously, I argue that race relations in the North were getting worse during this period of time. The most conspicuous example of deteriorating race relations were race riots. Prior to this point, race riots were a Southern phenomenon. Many examples of race riots in the South, but not in the North. After World War I, however, which, as of course you all know, ended in 1918, race riots began to occur in northern cities, and eventually, as I'll talk about in a minute, even in western cities. The most famous example of northern race riots during this period was the 1919 Chicago race riot, which lasted for 6 days and left 38 people dead. Racially motivated lynchings also began to occur in the North during this period of time. Here is a photograph of gruesome, of 3 black men who were lynched in, of all places, Duluth, Minnesota. This is not backwater Mississippi. This is Duluth, Minnesota. In Montana, there were 40 active Ku Klux Klan chapters during the mid-1920s. Here is an advertisement for the Butte chapter. Many communities in the North and the West also began to follow the Southern example of racial segregation during this period of time. Municipal swimming pools, which, as you now know, I know something about. Municipal swimming pools throughout the country became racially segregated during this period of time, not just in the South, in the North, and in the West. Communities throughout the country separated blacks from whites at municipal pools. In many instances, the means of imposing racial segregation was through violence. I found countless examples of white swimmers literally beating blacks out of pools in order to enforce segregation. This is in Pittsburgh, Chicago, again, northern cities. It's also worth noting that government policies during this period, even under the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, discriminated against and severely injured black Americans. I could give you many examples, but I will limit myself to one one that's relevant to a lot of us, me not quite yet. The Social Security Act of 1935. Social Security Act of 1935 enacted old age pensions, and it also enacted unemployment insurance. The two largest occupational categories excluded from these government benefits, you might call them government programs, I call them government benefits, were farm workers and domestic servants. Not coincidentally, those were the two largest occupations for black men and black women, respectively. Racial discrimination and bad race relations continued into the early years of World War II. In many ways, you can interpret the early years of World War II as the nadir, the low point of race relations in the 20th century for the United States. Race riots continued to erupt in American cities, the two most famous being the 1943 Detroit race riot and the 1943 Zoot Suit riots, which I just like to say, Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. As I'm sure all of you know, black Americans were discriminated against in the military. Not only did they serve in segregated units, but they were also primarily given what was known as fatigue duty, hard physical labor, loading and unloading ships, digging latrines and trenches, cleaning the quarters of other soldiers. Why were they given this duty? Because the leaders within the military believed that black Americans were innately well suited for physical labor, but that they inherently lacked the courage and bravery necessary to be a good fighting soldier. The worst example of racial discrimination, or sort of the best example, but anyway, the worst form of racial discrimination during the war was, to my mind, Japanese internment. The federal government imprisoned is the appropriate word, imprisoned approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, about 80,000 of whom were US citizens. Stop and think about that. 80,000 of which were US citizens, born here, most of them in the United States, had never been to Japan. And yet, the assumption was because of their racial identity, they would be more loyal to Japan, a country they'd never been to, than they would be to their home country that they were citizens. I mean, this is the stock that people at the time put into racial difference and racial identity. Now, I've spent this time detailing or describing the state of race relations leading up to the early years of the war to put the change that happens after World War II and the influence that an American dilemma has upon the liberal turn in social attitudes after the war into historical perspective. I think a lot of people assume or believe that, well, race relations in the United States had been improving throughout the 20th century, and okay, maybe that change accelerated after the war years, but it was basically the same trajectory of change. No. Race relations were, to my mind, deteriorating, and that the early years of World War II marks the low point, the nadir. But, and this is a nice but, World War II also marks the turning point, a historic turning point in racial attitudes or assumptions about race and government policies towards race. There were several things that happened during the war which caused many Americans to open themselves up, open their minds to new ideas about race, and also created after the war a movement to change public policies. One of the things that happened during the war was that black Americans served the nation as soldiers and as workers. They served the nation in a war which fought against repressive and undemocratic regimes abroad. When that war ended, they were not willing to accept discrimination here at home. Another factor that contributed after the war to this liberal shift in racial attitudes and social attitudes that I'll get to in a moment was that the war stimulated an ideological reawakening within the United States. The domestic propaganda at the time told Americans, and here's two examples of World War II posters, told Americans that this was a life and death struggle for America's democratic ideals, for liberty, for freedom, and explicitly and implicitly encouraged Americans to recommit themselves to these American ideals. This emotional recommitment to liberty, equality, and justice is well expressed in a letter that was written by a white soldier to his hometown Detroit newspaper, admonishing the city after the 1943 race riot. Everyone catch that? So here's a passage from a letter written by a white soldier to the hometown Detroit newspaper. And my point with it is that it expresses this recommitment, emotional recommitment to American ideals. He wrote, "Why are race riots going on in Detroit and in other cities in this land, supposedly the land of freedom, equality, and brotherhood? Americanism means everything to us soldiers." And then he goes on to list the different soldiers who were with him in the infirmary. "In this hospital ward, we eat, laugh, and sleep uncomplainingly together. Jim Stanley, Negro, Joe Wakamatau, Japanese, Ing Yu, Chinese, on and on." And then his last line is, "We want to know you want us back regardless of creed, race, or color." Similarly, Nazi oppression of Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, Slavs, and most especially the Holocaust caused many Americans to question their own assumptions and beliefs about race and racial difference. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Holocaust was that Nazis justified the extermination of Jews and other people they deemed inferior using racist arguments that were very similar to what a lot of Americans believed. Now, I don't know of too many Americans at the time who believed that people who were racially different should be murdered, but Americans variously believed that people who were racially different should not be allowed to vote, they should be socially separated, and in many cases should not be allowed to have children. Eugenics. The horror of seeing Nazis carry these deterministic views of racial difference to extreme ends, the murder of millions of people, caused at least some Americans to take a step back and say, you know, maybe I need to rethink my own attitudes about racial difference if this is where those beliefs can lead. Finally, work in war industries also opened the door to a liberal shift in social attitudes after the war. Before the war, many Americans had minimal contact with people who were racially different from themselves. As a result, their perception of racial others was based in large part upon stereotypes and prejudices. In the wartime factories and manufacturing plants, however, whites and blacks and Latinos commonly worked side by side with one another, a point nicely demonstrated in this World War II poster. In some cases, the diverse work environments helped break down stereotypes and eroded prejudices. A woman named Inez Sauer worked at Boeing during World War II. After the war, she was interviewed about her experience. This is one of the things that she said. Before my job at Boeing, I had had no contact with Negroes except as maids and gardeners. My mother was a Virginian, and we were brought up to think that colored people were not of the same economic or social level. I learned differently at Boeing. I learned that because a girl is a Negro, she's not necessarily a maid, and because a man is a Negro doesn't mean all he can do is dig. In fact, I found that some of the black people I got to know there were very superior, and certainly equal to me, equal to anyone I ever knew. An American Dilemma was published at this opportune moment. Many Americans were open to new ideas about race and racial equality, and Myrdal supplied them with those ideas. And he backed it up with 1,483 pages of evidence and the authority of the social sciences. Whatever you think of the social sciences now, and of course we think of them very highly, this was in many ways the peak of the social sciences. I'm trying to be careful of how to put this. This was when the social sciences were at their most credible. They're still credible, but this is when they were at their most credible in many ways. So what were Myrdal's conclusions? Let's delve into the text a bit and familiarize ourselves with his conclusions. His most general conclusion was that the race problem in America was, at its root, a problem of the heart. A problem of the heart. This is what he wrote. The American Negro problem is a problem in the heart of the American. It is there that the interracial tension has its focus. It is there that the decisive struggle goes on. As that last phrase suggests, Myrdal believed, or he concluded, that a war raged in the hearts of Americans. An internal conflict, an internal moral conflict between Americans' belief in the American creed, in democratic principles on the one hand, and racial prejudice on the other. I mean, he believed that in the hearts of all Americans, there was this conflict, this internal struggle between their belief in American ideals and yet also racial prejudice. This is a point he expressed most dramatically in this passage, and I probably don't have time for this, but this is such a great passage, I have to read it. We find that even a poor and uneducated white person in some isolated and backward rural region in the Deep South, who is violently prejudiced against the Negro and intent upon depriving him of civic rights and human independence, has also a whole compartment in his valuation sphere housing the entire American creed of liberty, equality, justice, and fair opportunity for everyone. He goes on then to say that this valuation sphere of the American creed also shapes his attitudes and actions. This internal war, I mean, stop and think. I mean, Myrdal says, here we've got what most people from today's perspective would consider to be an inveterate racist, has this entire valuation sphere of faith in and adherence to American democratic principles. The implication was that the race problem could be solved by Americans wholeheartedly embracing the American creed over prejudice. All Americans have both of these in them. The key to solving the race problem is for Americans to wholeheartedly embrace the American creed over racial prejudice. Had Myrdal located the root of the race problem in institutions such as government or in exploitive economic relationships or in innate and unchangeable racial characteristics, then the implication would have been that the race problem was unsolvable or could only be solved through political revolution and or structural economic change. I mean, this might have been the conclusion. I mean, what, a 5-6 year study of the race problem in America? It might have led to the conclusion that, this is an intractable, unsolvable historical problem because it's rooted in discriminatory institutions, exploitive economic relationships, and in at least the assumption of innate and unchangeable racial characteristics. That would have been a pessimistic conclusion. No. Myrdal concluded that the problem was in the heart of Americans, and what Americans needed to do was change their hearts. This was inspiring in its optimism and hopefulness. Now, Myrdal also posited several more specific conclusions that would prove influential as well. One was that blacks and whites were essentially the same, meaning that race is only skin deep. As Myrdal himself wrote, it became increasingly evident that little, if anything, could be scientifically explained in terms of the peculiarities of the Negroes themselves. As a matter of fact, in their basic human traits, the Negroes are inherently not much different from other people. Neither are, incidentally, white Americans. In claiming this, Myrdal was challenging the entrenched and pervasive belief that race was a very meaningful social distinction. That people from different races were fundamentally and unchangeably different from one another. Myrdal concluded, no. People from different races are essentially, by which I mean in their essence, the same. Another provocative conclusion in An American Dilemma was that the race problem in America was really a problem with whites. Myrdal wrote, "The Negro problem is predominantly a white man's problem." What he meant by that is the bad conditions that black Americans suffered in the United States resulted from mistreatment and discrimination by whites. Again, this was a shocking conclusion for many Americans at the time. The assumption or the belief of most whites at the time was that black Americans occupied the bottom rung of society because they were innately inferior to whites. And that was their natural station because of their incapacity. Myrdal says no. Black Americans occupy the bottom rung of society, or they've been forced onto the bottom rung of society by mistreatment and discrimination. Relatedly, Myrdal concluded that racial segregation, the social separation of blacks from whites, was doing real damage to the nation as a whole. Put another way, he was saying racial segregation was bad and it was harming the nation. For one, he argued that the separating of blacks from whites had caused racial antagonisms to increase. What he was thinking was that if blacks and whites were interacting with one another more, then there wouldn't be the level of animosity and antagonism that he found while studying the race problem in America. Furthermore, he argued and harnessed lots of evidence to show that segregation severely injured black Americans. It injured them materially and it injured them psychologically. Finally, at the end of his study, Myrdal recommended an approach for solving the race problem in America. This is what he wrote. From the point of view of social science, this means, among other things, that to solve the race problem, social engineering will be increasingly demanded. Many things that for a long period have been predominantly a matter of individual adjustment will become more and more determined by political decision and public regulation. In short, the government, especially the federal government, must actively lead the nation towards ending racial discrimination and uplifting black Americans through enlightened public policy. As this quote suggests, Myrdal was a mid-century liberal par excellence. He had immense faith in the efficacy of government action. There are few books and probably no scholarly studies that have impacted American attitudes and government policies as much as An American Dilemma. One scholar has concluded, quote, "An American Dilemma was the most powerful instrument the most powerful instrument of action in the field of race relations since Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin." For those of you who were here a couple weeks ago, it makes a nice connection. Much of the impact that An American Dilemma had upon post-war America resulted from its influence on popular attitudes and assumptions. Throughout the post-war period, Myrdal's ideas were widely disseminated through newspaper and magazine articles, through speeches and government reports, and through revised textbooks and school curriculums. It's not an overstatement to say that a generation of Americans were inundated with Myrdal's ideas. Now, for those of you who were alive and can recall this period of time, you may be thinking, well, I've never heard of Gunnar Myrdal. That's because you were getting his ideas oftentimes secondhand and thirdhand. That his ideas were influencing educators, influencing journalists, influencing policymakers. And then they would express his ideas and draw conclusions from his ideas, but not necessarily mention, oh, by the way, I got this from Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. In a nutshell, and if there's sort of a thesis statement to my talk tonight, this is probably it. An American Dilemma provided the conceptual framework that guided post-war America in the rethinking of racial ideologies and in the reform of discriminatory public policies. It provided a conceptual framework that guided the nation in the rethinking of racial ideologies and the reform of discriminatory public policies. It's a big claim. Let me give you some examples which will hopefully convince you of that. One area where the impact of Myrdal's ideas is clearly apparent is in federal policies. In 1946, 2 years after the publication of An American Dilemma and 1 year after World War II, then President Harry Truman established the President's Committee on Civil Rights and charged it with proposing government policies that would combat racial discrimination and strengthen civil rights. 1 year later, in 1947, the committee issued its report titled "To Secure These Rights," which some of you may have heard of. It borrowed heavily from An American Dilemma, but it never mentioned An American Dilemma. One of the things, and I don't have time for this, but what you do is you go back and read the reports that were used to write the final report, sort of the white sheets, the white pages, I guess is what people call them. That's where you have all the littered references to Myrdal and American Dilemma. Once it comes out in the government report, there's no more mention of Myrdal. But it borrowed heavily from Gunnar Myrdal. Later policymakers in the Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration acknowledged that Myrdal's ideas influenced their efforts. Let me say that again. Acknowledged that Myrdal's influence on their efforts to achieve or to end racial discrimination was, in one word, pervasive. The key point, for me at least, is that after 1944, the federal government accepted Myrdal's view that it must play a leading role in combating racial discrimination. Now you could say, well, isn't this just a part of sort of the liberal thinking of the time? Well, yes and no. I mean, there was definitely a liberal view of government during the Roosevelt administration from 1932 to early 1945. And yet, the Roosevelt administration can be described at best as being passive on issues of race and racial discrimination. And the reality is that Roosevelt was uninterested in issues of race. And if someone wants to ask me a question about this at the end, I'd love to talk a lot more about this. But one quick example. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was unwilling to support a federal anti-lynching law. How can you not support a federal anti-lynching law? He was unwilling to support a federal anti-lynching law. Gives you some sense that sort of racial discrimination was not high on his priority list of concerns. After 1944, though, it was relatively high on the priority list for the federal government, just as Myrdal had said it had to be. Perhaps the most famous example of An American Dilemma's influence on post-war America is the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, which ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. I know that there are a couple lawyers in the crowd, so I will tread lightly here. This was a landmark ruling that overturned the court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision. In Plessy, back in 1896, the Supreme Court famously ruled that segregation was constitutional as long as the facilities provided for blacks were equal to the facilities provided for whites. This is the separate but equal standard. To justify its reversal of Plessy, the 1954 court relied heavily on what's called sociological jurisprudence. This is a fancy phrase that basically means looking beyond the law, looking at social conditions as a basis for deciding one way or another in a case. This is explicitly what the Warren Court did in the Brown decision. The court concluded that school segregation was unconstitutional, even if the schools were equal, because the segregation itself injured African American children socially and psychologically. This was not legal reasoning, this was sociological reasoning. Now, how could the court support this claim? By citing Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the Brown decision, and in it, this is maybe the key sentence in the decision. Whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy v. Ferguson, this finding that segregation is harmful to blacks is amply supported by modern authority. Then came one of the most famous footnotes in all of American history, footnote number 11, which identified An American Dilemma as the main authority for this claim. Myrdal's study was in this way instrumental in legally overthrowing segregation. Finally, I'll talk about the civil rights movement more generally. An American Dilemma did not, I emphasize did not, cause the civil rights movement. It did not initiate the civil rights movement. And yet, it is fair to say that Myrdal's study influenced the civil rights movement. Although, to what extent it influenced the civil rights movement is a very difficult question to answer. If you step back and take a broad view of the civil rights movement up until 1965, this is important. If you take a broad view of the civil rights movement up until 1965, the movement mirrors to a remarkable degree the ideas that Myrdal expressed in An American Dilemma. Let me give you a couple of examples. Civil rights activists sought to bring about this historic social change through moderate, non-violent, non-revolutionary means. Let me change to my photograph of the civil rights movement. Just as Myrdal had recommended, civil rights activists sought to work within the political system, looking to the courts and to the federal government to push society towards equality. Civil rights activists also consistently appealed to the conscience of white Americans, seemingly accepting Myrdal's contention that white Americans were conflicted about racial discrimination. I could right now parade quote after quote after quote from Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech to emphasize the appeal to the conscience of white Americans, but I suspect you know the text well enough. More generally, civil rights activists expressed the same optimism as had Myrdal, that this historically intractable problem was now solvable, could now be solved. I mean, this may be one of Myrdal's most important contributions, is the problem of race has a long history in the United States, and a seemingly unsolvable, intractable problem. And here's Myrdal saying, oh no, it can be solved, and now's the time to solve it. Many civil rights activists took considerable inspiration from that. Civil rights activists also openly celebrated American democratic ideals, just as Myrdal had. This is one of the reasons I wanted to have this photograph with the American flags. The civil rights movement up until 1965 was not an attack on American ideals, which it might have been. It was rather a celebration of American ideals and a demand that the nation live up to those ideals of liberty, equality, and justice. Oh, wait a minute, isn't that exactly how Myrdal had framed it? Lastly, the civil rights movement focused on ending segregation, assimilating Black Americans into American society, and creating a colorblind society. This was the social extension of Myrdal's claim that all people are essentially the same. I mean, you could create a colorblind society, or you could believe you could create a colorblind society, only if you believed that race was only skin deep and that people were really essentially the same. The difficulty is to determine, did Myrdal merely anticipate how the civil rights movement would unfold? In other words, maybe it was the case that Myrdal was just a really good prognosticator, and he anticipated how the civil rights movement would unfold. Or did his ideas actually shape the unfolding of the civil rights movement? My conclusion is that it's some of both. I mean, clearly, all that I just described did not occur solely because Gunnar Myrdal had written An American Dilemma. To a certain extent, he anticipated how the civil rights movement would unfold. But it's also clearly the case that he influenced it as well. And perhaps the best way to recognize that is to listen to the historical actors themselves. When the Greensboro Four say that it was their reading of An American Dilemma that in part inspired them to sit down at the Woolworth's lunch counter, it's reasonable to conclude that civil rights activists were inspired by An American Dilemma. When Martin Luther King Jr. writes in Stride Towards Freedom, which maybe some of you have read, that Myrdal's An American Dilemma helped him understand the race problem as a moral problem, it's reasonable to conclude that Myrdal's ideas shaped the thinking of civil rights leaders. From the vantage point of 1962, another civil rights activist remarked that Myrdal's ideas provided, and I quote, a kind of background music to the civil rights struggle. I don't think I can sum it up more eloquently than that. Let me conclude with this observation. I don't think I've run too much over. Let me conclude with this observation. As much as An American Dilemma influenced post-war America, and I hope that I've convinced you that it did, Myrdal's study was also very much a product of its time. Myrdal's conclusions about race gained so much currency in part because they fit comfortably within the liberal consensus that existed in America at the time. In some ways, Myrdal's ideas contributed to it, but they gained so much currency because they fit very comfortably within the liberal consensus of the time. However, when that liberal consensus began to break apart in the mid to late 1960s, Myrdal's ideas lost their influence. Think about what we know about the mid to late 1960s. Black power advocates did not want to assimilate into white American society. They wanted to break more forcefully away from it. Black nationalists did not believe that all people are essentially the same. They emphasized their differentness from white Americans. Martin Luther King Jr., the most Myrdalian of all civil rights activists, had become quite pessimistic by 1967 and 1968. He no longer had faith that white Americans were internally conflicted about racial discrimination. And he had come to believe that racial inequality was in large part based upon structural problems that could not easily be overcome. On the opposite side of the political spectrum, there was a backlash among many whites against federal activism. They'd come to believe that the social engineering with regards to race of the federal government had gone too far. And so the ideas of an American dilemma, which had been so influential during the post-war period, were largely repudiated by the late 1960s. And trust me, this is my last point. So does that mean that an American dilemma no longer influences our society? What was the title of this? Works that shape our lives? Well, we're living now in 2010, and if Myrdal's ideas were repudiated in the late 1960s, what are you talking about? Well, if we accept that Myrdal's ideas influenced the civil rights revolution of the post-war period, then he most certainly continues to shape our society. When you look at what's happened over the last couple of decades, a growing black middle class, institutions like government, business, entertainment, military, universities, becoming much more integrated than they had in the past. Almost all forms of public discrimination have been eradicated from American society. The United States just elected a black president. All of these ongoing historical developments are rooted in the civil rights revolution of the post-war period, which, again, as I hope I've convinced you, Gunnar Myrdal shaped in significant ways. Thank you.
Could you use Myrdal's argument about it being a conflict in the heart and substitute the gay community for the black community?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I'd have to think about that. The most immediate thing, though, that comes to mind is that part of the power of that construction of the race problem was that it appealed to the religious sensibilities of Americans. This idea of having a change of heart, a change of mind, it's almost like something of a religious conversion. I mean, that you know the right path, choose the right path, and you will be saved and society will be redeemed. It conjures up images in my mind of an altar call at an evangelical church. But the point, I think, to my mind, is that it very much appealed to the religious sensibilities of the American people by framing it in those terms. There are a lot of sort of religious institutions in America who are dead set, who are the leaders against gay rights. And I don't suspect that framing gay rights issues in those terms would appeal to them in the same way as back during the post-war period framing sort of racial inequality did. I'm trying to, No, I mean, let me respond this way. That was an inspirational way for Myrdal to frame the race problem, but historically, it's inaccurate. I mean, I sort of was suggesting this, that the race problem has much deeper roots than that it's rooted in discriminatory institutions, discriminatory laws, unequal and exploitive economic relationships, and it wasn't a particularly accurate assessment of the race problem. Now, is it a more accurate assessment of sort of the discrimination against homosexuals? I don't know. I'd have to think more about that. This is not something I've thought about.
The idea that Myrdal said it's needs a change of heart of the American people, and that what we need to go back to is our sense of equality and justice and liberty. And I'm wondering if you'd comment on, if you look at Europe now, and particularly France and Sarkozy, and saying we can't have burqas, we can't have anything that looks different than who we are they really inherently different than we are, or are we lucky to be here and be more open-minded about it? Is there a real difference between the way the rest of the world sees equality, liberty, and justice and the way we see it?
What I would say is, I had to skip over this for the sake of time, is that what happens in the 1970s in the United States, so you've got Myrdal saying people are essentially the same. And then in the mid to late 1960s, people challenging that, and black nationalists, black separatists, and you've got sort of and you remember the Gray Panthers? The American Indian movement, you've got all these different groups of people wanting to assert their differentness. I mean, this is kind of what I'm seeing with the example of sort of the burqas, say, in France. This poses, obviously, an ideological problem for any society, which is you've got people wanting to emphasize how different they are from one another. So how does the United States respond to that? By celebrating multiculturalism. So it was during the 1970s and in the 1980s where multiculturalism becomes the civic religion in America. And essentially the argument is that, okay, maybe Myrdal was right that biologically we're all really the same. But the point that Myrdal missed is that culturally we're very different. And that what we need to do as a society is celebrate our cultural differentness. And I think that in large part the United States was able to do that as much because of our immigrant tradition as because of, say, the racial diversity. I mean, as I suspect all of you know, I mean, one of the realities, the ongoing realities of United States history is having to assimilate foreign people into American society. And as you do that over and over and over again, you perhaps develop some skill at doing it, but maybe you develop the sensibilities to enable you to do that. France and most European countries haven't had that history. And so that it was easier for the United States to say, you know, let's just celebrate multiculturalism. In part because what it has meant historically to be an American has evolved. It's changed. In places like France, and I'm not a French scholar, but in places like France and in Germany, there's a more static notion of what it means to be French or German. I mean, to be French means to drink Bordeaux and red Burgundy, to eat food that has a lot of cream sauce to it. It's there's a shared cultural sense of what it means. United States, it's been all over the place. And in some ways, the reality of what it means to be an American is to be a consumer, to participate in consumer society and the consumer economy. And I know that we criticize that as being superficial, but it's the most practical national culture for a society of immigrants. But going back, I think that Americans were able to develop this civic religion or the civic ideology of multiculturalism because of this past, whereas France and Germany have had a much, much more difficult time. I'm not in control of the questioning.
What initiated the Carnegie Foundation to initiate this study, and why did they select Murdo?
Thank you. So mainly the Carnegie, and it wasn't the Carnegie Foundation at that time, it was the Carnegie Corporation. And I don't remember the man's name, but who was in charge of it, he just had a personal interest in trying to push the country along towards solving the race problem. And he thought, well, why not commission a major study of it? So really, it was sort of the brainchild of one person, the leader. And the reason he and the Carnegie Corporation chose Myrdal, a Swedish economist, is because they wanted to find someone who could look at the race problem with fresh eyes. With eyes, that were untinted, or I mean, you might better say untainted, by having lived in the society with the problem that was under investigation. I mean, this was not the first attempt to analyze race relations, racial discrimination in the United States. This was on a scale and a magnitude larger than most previous studies. And so it wasn't as though this was an unprecedented effort. They wanted a foreigner because they wanted someone to approach it with fresh eyes, essentially.
Despite the progress that you have mentioned since Brown versus the Board of Education, just could you address the issue of from what my point of view would be the plight of inner city urban schools today? For example, Kansas City was just saying they were closing, I forget, like 33%, or possibly considering 33% of their public schools because of they've become basically just poor ghetto schools, and the funding and the inequalities that, even though we've tried to address it, still exist.
Oh yeah. And let me answer it this way. If you don't like my answer, then you can press me on something more particular. But this is really a hornet's nest. Among scholars in a variety of different fields, there is a very heated and ongoing debate about basically this question, which is, was the civil rights revolution a success or a failure? I mean, a lot of people argue, still in the mind frame of the mid to late 1960s, that it really didn't succeed. It seems to me, and I disagree with that, as you could probably tell by the end of my lecture, it seems to me that that argument is based upon setting an unrealistic standard for what success would mean. Have we achieved in the United States a level of true racial equality? No. But I don't even know what that would mean. I have no idea how you would measure something like that. Have the conditions for Black Americans, the rights for Black Americans, have race relations, have all this improved significantly since, say, 1944 or 1945? Absolutely. I mean, what's the phrase? It's sort of not even in the same league. I mean, we're talking the difference between Little League and the major leagues. I mean, read. I mean, anyone who wants to get a good sense of how far we've come, sit down with these 1,483 pages, most of which is devoted to how pervasive racial discrimination was, how bad conditions were for Black Americans. Now, have we achieved true racial equality? No. Is that possible? I don't know. I don't think any longer people believe, like Myrdal believed, that we can somehow achieve a colorblind society. I think sort of that optimistic view has, I don't know too many people who hold that. I think race is always going to be in America a meaningful social distinction. But it is clearly not as debilitating a distinction as it has been historically. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer to your question or not.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You've convinced me I've got to now read An American Dilemma, which is a victory. But in one sense, I was a little puzzled because you treated Myrdal's book as though it emerged in a vacuum. But in fact, in the 30s and 40s, there's a tremendous tradition of social protest fiction, and I'm thinking especially of Richard Wright, and particularly Black Boy, I suppose, although Native Son is more famous. And I found myself wondering why Myrdal's book became the source text, the influential text, the text that's cited over and over again, rather than, say, some of the testimony of, say, major black writers like Richard Wright.
In large part, I think it's because of the amount of evidence that he harnesses, and as I think I suggested at one point in the talk, because it came with the authority of the social sciences. I mean, it's one thing for someone to write a novel, and that's impressionistic. That's one person's view, and it's fiction. I mean, it's one person's made-up view. In Myrdal's study, there is example after example after an example. I mean, an immense amount of evidence supporting his conclusions. Now, as I suggested, many of his conclusions turn out to be, from our perspective now, quite dubious. But at the time, it carried with it the legitimacy of the social sciences. And as I said before, this was a period in American history in which people really believed that this was a science, the social sciences. And that gave it a tremendous amount of authority. You can tell me and then I'll repeat it.
Well, I imagine the curriculums have changed a lot over the years. I remember when I was in school, having quite a lot of inspiration about our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and all the rest. And today, that's less so. It seems
Oh,
to be
yes.
much less so. And I wonder, if that isn't significant as far as an idea about everyone being equal and made in God's image. If that's less acceptable today, that would make the continuation of this idea less popular.
Yeah, so a question and a comment about the extent to which school curriculum, and I mean, I can talk somewhat authoritatively about history, because that's what I know about, but the history curriculum, and how different it is now from how, say, it was in the 1950s. And that change really was a product of the mid to late 1960s and the early 1970s. I mean, that's where this old celebratory story of American history, much like Myrdal's ideas. I mean, this is the interesting thing about Myrdal, is for all of the prejudice and discrimination and mistreatment that Myrdal found in his study, he celebrated the American people, which was suggested in this idea that there's this internal conflict, that Americans really are, sort of, really believe in the American creed. But more generally, he had a very, very favorable impression of the American people, and in some ways, if you take out the racial discrimination, a pretty celebratory view of U.S. history. And so he was very much a part of that sensibility that was commonplace during the 1950s and the early 1960s. Scholars, historians, began to interpret U.S. history more critically in the mid-1960s, the late 1960s, and then thereafter. And it was a reaction to sort of the larger social protests of the time and the how best to put it, the disdain is too strong of a word, I'm trying to think of the right word, that it was a reaction to the criticizing of the United States that became commonplace during that period of time. And that was picked up by scholars who then went back and took, again, a more critical view of it. And so I guess in answer to your question, Myrdal, I would argue, was more in line with the more celebratory interpretations of the 50s, and that as his ideas were challenged, that was at the same time in which scholars began to take a more critical look at the past as well. Yeah. Or,
I was just wondering, Myrdal seemed to think that the government needed to take a, a
absolutely, one of
strong
his core ideas,
forefront.
yes.
How would he have felt about the government's experimentation on the Tuskegee Airmen?
I have no idea how he would have felt. I mean, I guess the question is, how do liberals, and I mean liberals in the real sense of believing in an active government, that you look to government to sort of solve problems and you empower government to solve problems. I guess your question is, how do liberals in that sense sort of make sense of government power run amok? This is a great example, and this is the beautiful irony of Watergate, is that Watergate was presidential power run amok. But it was a president who was a Republican. And now, Nixon was not sort of a conservative like a lot of Republicans are today. We would consider him most definitely a moderate. In many ways, he expanded the power of the federal government. But this is, I don't know. But I think it's a fascinating question, which is if you believe in the efficacy, the effectiveness of government to solve problems, how then do you grapple with or make sense of when government power is used in bad ways? I don't know. I don't want to answer for all the liberals.
My question is in quite a different direction. You make the case rather convincingly that FDR gets really poor marks in this regard. What do you think might have been the case if Eleanor had been in charge of the Roosevelt administration instead of Franklin?
The results may not have been different, but she would have at least tried. The excuse for Franklin Delano Roosevelt is that, well, you had so many Southern Democrats in key positions in Congress that he could not get any legislation passed that was obnoxious to white Southerners. Well, maybe, maybe not. You can say the same thing about Congress in the mid-1960s, and by God, Lyndon Baines Johnson got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act passed through. But Eleanor Roosevelt would have at least tried. And there's very clear evidence that she pushed Roosevelt in particular on the issue of the anti-lynching law. And he just said no. And the prevailing interpretation is that Franklin Roosevelt was not willing to expend any of his enormous political capital on questions of race. And the further apologists argue that what Roosevelt believed was that the best way that he could help black Americans was through general economic growth and prosperity. That the best way that black Americans are going to be helped is if he could help pull the nation out of the Depression, and that's what's going to most benefit them, not sort of legislation specifically targeted to their benefit. And yet the opposing view, I'll stop this in a moment, and the opposing view is that, well, okay, Roosevelt probably could not have gotten past legislation that was targeted to benefit black Americans. But did he have to let the Southern Democrats reshape essential New Deal legislation to make sure that other people benefited, but black Americans didn't benefit? Let me give you one more example, and then this is another great one, which was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This was the origins of farm subsidies, which were put into place, passed in 1933. So in the South, the basic arrangement was that you had white landowners, and then you had a lot of tenant farmers or sharecroppers. And a lot of the sharecroppers were black, some of the sharecroppers were white. You had both. The way in which the AAA legislation was written was that the federal government paid money to farmers to take their land out of production. Who did that money go to? To the land owners, not the people working the land. Which meant, I mean, think about this for a minute. All right, here you've got a farmer, and he's got maybe, he may farm a third of his land, and then the other 2/3 of his land is being farmed by black sharecroppers. The federal government comes to him and says, we're going to pay you X amount of money to take half of your acreage out of production. What acreage do you think he's going to take out of production? Not what he's farming, what the sharecroppers are farming. They're now out of a livelihood. And in some instances, because they're not economically beneficial to the landholder anymore, they're kicked off the land. It could have been written differently. There's clear evidence that it was written in this way so that black Southerners would not benefit from it. And now, if you ask Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is this what you want to see happen? He obviously would have said no. But are you willing to fight to prevent this from happening? Absolutely not. Whereas Eleanor would have.